So in this video, we're going to talk about how our brain files traumatic memories. It's really going to help us to understand why trauma feels like it's always happening in the present. Most of the time when we are remembering something that happened in the past, it's a form of explicit memory or autobiographical memory, where we're thinking of the memory and we know more or less when it happened. So for example, I was remarried 10 years ago. These 10 years have flown by, but I can feel the space between when I got married and where I am now. My son was born 18 years ago. And again, even though it feels like time flies, and for any parent out there, it really, really does. Even though that's the case, I can still feel the distance, right? I still know that I didn't have him yesterday. It's very clear that he's not an infant, that he's a young man. And so the brain is able to know this memory happened that long ago. There's a timestamp on it. The problem is that when we have trauma, when we're going through trauma, the hippocampus gets affected due to chronic stress. Being stuck in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn all the time affects the ability of our hippocampus to work properly, which means memories come in and they don't get that timestamp. So imagining our hippocampus like a librarian. Imagine people coming in and they're bringing their books, right? The librarian puts the stamp on and then files them where the book is supposed to go. But let's say somebody comes in and just dumps a ton of books all at once, and there's so many that the librarian is overloaded, puts those aside and just deals with the day-to-day, one book at a time person that comes in, right? And that pile just stays there. Something similar happens to us with traumatic memories. When something happens that is too much, too fast, too soon, and with no support for our nervous system to work through it, it's like an overload happens, an overload of information that affects our hippocampus's ability to put that timestamp. And so those memories are sitting there, like those books that were like piled on in a corner. And they're sitting there in our implicit memory. Now, unlike explicit memories that have that timestamp that you know that, yes, this happened this long ago, everything that's stored in our implicit memory is stored in the present tense. So if I had a lot of trauma in a relationship, let's say a parent relationship where I was shamed for being my authentic self, like just breathing would cause suffering for me. Instead of feeling like when I was a child, I was shamed every time I did this, that, or the other thing. When it's in our implicit memory, it's almost like to our nervous system, I am being shamed every day for this, that, and the other thing. So without that timestamp, that's why we feel like the past, we can't seem to leave it in the past, not because we're not strong enough, not because we're not trying to heal, not because we don't want to let go, but because our brain, the way our brain works with trauma memories, is not allowing us to do so. So I say that so that you can take some of the shame off of yourself, because I know when I was not understanding this, I thought that only further made me feel like there was something severely wrong with me, which only fed the shame. And I just want to talk a little bit about implicit memory a little bit more. It's not just learning with words. What gets stored in our implicit memory is emotional learning. They're the emotional truths that we learned through experience. And that's why it's a struggle to work through past trauma as well, because maybe in the past I was shamed for being my authentic self, right? But maybe logically, I know that it's normal. Like everyone's allowed to be themselves. It's a normal thing. I logically know that. It makes complete sense. But that logical learning is stored in the cortical regions of our brain, whereas our emotional learning, the things we learn through experience, the things that are stored where our implicit memory is stored, that's subcortical. So it's in two different areas of the brain that it's almost like they speak two different languages, right? One is through words, maybe through learning, through thinking, and the other is through experiencing and feeling and sensing. One common example people use to explain implicit memory is riding a bike. Well, why is that such a great example of implicit memory? Well, there's so much you can learn by a book, right? How, okay, you put your foot here, you do this, and you get that cognitive learning. But it's nothing like when you actually get on the bike and you can feel the lack of balance and you learn how to sense into how to stay balanced and riding that bike without falling. Two separate things from book learning or cognitive learning and actually experiencing. So, what is in our implicit memory are things that we learned through experience. And as adults, they can defy normal logic, right? For example, some things that we learn in childhood that we learn and are stuck in our implicit memory are the beliefs there's something wrong with me. Maybe there's absolutely nothing wrong with that child. There never was anything wrong with that child, but the parent maybe had a personality disorder. Maybe they had NPD, BPD, or maybe they struggled with addictions, or they had their own trauma, unhealed trauma. And they felt like there was something wrong with them. They never got healed and they projected that onto the child, right? When that child grows up, all the logic in the world of saying there's nothing wrong with you, it's going to be head knowledge for a long time until they can learn how to help their body to feel the truth of those words.